Perfect. Thank you. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this lunch and learn about information privacy and data protection and how to protect privacy at work and at home. I know a lot of you may have heard that privacy is dead, but it is not. That is a misconception. And I would even argue that it is proliferated by folks who want to take and use our data. So this is a great opportunity for us to talk about how the decisions that we make every day can protect our privacy and also protect our data. And so in this session, what we're going to talk about is what we can do at home, what we can do at the workplace to protect our privacy, and the things that we should be keeping in mind. So that includes things like policies that apply to how we handle sensitive data, and that includes PII and a subset of PII, which would be our protected health information. So giving away our data can expose us to identity theft. And I think it's really easy for us to forget that. And part of what we'll talk about today is some of the things that we might be doing that we're not even aware of that give away our data and make us more susceptible. And I'm thinking about people who post their birthdays, right? So everybody wants to be on Facebook and have well, probably people who are under the Gen X's aren't necessarily on Facebook, but whatever the platform is, if you're giving away that type of information, or quizzes, right? The quizzes that we take that ask, what's your pet's name? What's your mother's maiden name? What city were you born in? All that kind of stuff. So I think that there's a twofold topic that we're looking at, which is privacy in the workplace and privacy in your personal lives. So we will get started. Okay, so I think that to ground this discussion, we have to look at what do we mean when we talk about information privacy. Information privacy, which is also called data privacy, is the right of individuals to control the collection and sharing of their personal information without consent. So consent is an important aspect of this, and we'll be talking more about this as we get into the FIPS. But in much of our lives, this ability to choose is present. And part of the myth that privacy is dead is so that we won't focus on that, right? So we won't read the privacy policies. We won't manage our cookies and say that we don't want to have people tracking us because we don't really understand necessarily what the implications of that are. And that is done for a specific purpose. Your data has a value. There is money to be made in it and the sharing of it. And that goes to the issue of information privacy, right? That you don't have the ability once that information leaves and is taken, that it might be shared across platforms, then people are tracking you. Have you ever had that creepy feeling where you feel like, and I get this all the time since I'm in privacy, people will write to me and say, I just mentioned this in a conversation with someone and now all of a sudden I'm getting these ads about it. And it's those sort of subtle things that are both upsetting and creepy that go to the issue of why we need to keep our information private. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so when we talk about information privacy, we have a couple of different terms that come up, right? Personally identifiable information, which people are probably familiar with. You hear this term all over the place, including in the federal government. We hear that PII is what it's called, right? Is information which can be used to distinguish or trace an individual's identity. So when we think about this, we have to think about it broadly. So for example, we might say that, okay, it's obvious that if you knew my name and you knew where I lived, right, that would be PII. But you might also be able to determine who I am, and that information would also be PII if what you had was that I was a chief privacy officer, right, and you had my zip code and that I was a woman, right? Just those three things could uniquely identify me and where I was if you had that information. So it's looking at it, and it's looking at how the information can be tracked and be used to trace or distinguish a person. So when we think about it, we need to think about it more broadly than just a list. So in North Carolina, this same PII is called personal information. And with personal information, we're talking about a person's first name or their first initial and their last name in combination with identifying information. And in our legislation, what we get is a list of things that can identify folks, but that's not an exhaustive list. And sometimes that's referring to things that you would have to determine was stuff like an identifying number. So when we think about what is PII, we have to think about not just what we think it is initially, but think about it critically and think about how people's information can be used and how they can be identified based on what information we're giving out. So another important thing I think also to talk about with relation to this is that when we misapply laws, if we misapply the laws, we may inadvertently, because all of us work for the state and represent the state, we could be putting out information that would then appear to be public information. So what I mean by that is if we determine that some information is not PII and so it's not protected, and then we put it out, then if it appears outside and we have released this information, it could appear that that information then becomes public information, and that would not be correct. So that's one of the reasons that we need to be so careful when we think about it on the front end to make sure that we don't run into that. So what we see is in our law, it says that public information does not include information that's publicly available in directories, right, that people have voluntarily consented to. So this is what I'm getting at when I say that. So we can't assume that someone has voluntarily consented unless we know that, right? Unless we have some proof of that. So if we then pull out something, the second part of this is that information that is lawfully made available to the general public from the federal, the state, or local government records is deemed to be public information. So if we were to put out stuff wrongly because we didn't check, right, and we didn't make sure that the people had given us that consent, if we then put it out, then we haven't put it out lawfully, but it could appear that that was the case. So we want to be very careful about what we do, and we want to err on the side of privacy. So there's privacy by design, which is where we design privacy into all the things that we're doing, which means that if we're considering setting up a system or a project or something like that, we're thinking about privacy at the forefront. And then there's privacy by default, and that's what we need to be practicing here when we look at the use of people's personally identifiable information or personal information, which is that our default position needs to be that we're going to protect their privacy unless we see that they have given us permission to release it, and we know that we're in the clear with that. So our default position should be to, excuse me, to protect the data that's entrusted to us by the people in our state. And what that means in the workplace is that we keep the personal information that's entrusted to us private, and that we apply the fair information practice principles, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. These were principles that we adopted in May of 2022, and they help to guide us to understand what it is that we should be doing and how we should do it. And what it is it's really a common sense set of principles that are designed to treat people's data fairly. They came about in the 1970s and with the federal government when they were just starting to use computers and they were putting people's data into databases and starting to be able to use it in ways that maybe didn't benefit people always in the way that it should. And a group got together, they looked at it, they thought about it, and they realized, you know what, we need some guiding principles to help make sure that we always stay on the right path with how we're handling the data of our citizens and our residents, right? And so with these same types of principles apply at the state level as well. Okay, so next slide. Oh, Kelly's doing such a fabulous job. We've been doing this for a while. So the fair information practice principles are the FIPS. I personally love them. I think they are excellent. They make sense to me. And I think that once we talk about them and they're explained, they'll make sense to you as well. So the first one is transparency, right? That the organization should be transparent and provide notice to the individual regarding its collection, use, and dissemination and maintenance of PII. And what that means is that we're not giving them any surprises, right? It should be that when a company tells you that this is how we're going to use your data, that that's how it's used. So what we want to do is that we want to have a situation where people understand what it is that they are doing when they give us their data. So at the state level, when we're asking people for information, we should be transparent about how we're going to use it, what we're going to do with it, right? Like if we have a time period that we need it and then we're going to get rid of that data, they should know that, and that should be obvious so that they don't have that nasty surprise at the end. One of the things that we want is for them not to find out that we've used their data in a way that they don't agree with, right? So the thing that I always think about, and this will be part of the other principles that I'm going to talk about in a minute, is I always think about when you sign up for something, right? If you signed up for a discount card, like at the grocery store, and then all of a sudden your mailbox and your inbox is full of advertisements for all these other different companies, right? I signed up to get a discount with company X. I didn't agree for them to sell my data to someone else, and then now all this junk is coming up that maybe I don't want and I don't need. And also, we have to think about it like this. The more people who have your data, the greater the exposure. So we're all trying to practice data protection, but at some point, right, we have the whole group of people who are out there trying to get our data. So the more times we let it out there, the more vulnerable it becomes. Then individual participation, right? So consent should be sought from the individual for the collection, use, and dissemination and maintenance of the PII, and a mechanism should be provided for appropriate access and correction and redress. So what this means is that we should be letting folks know that they have the option to not give us information. And even if they don't, we might have a separate process, right? It might be that if you feel that you don't want to give for whatever, if we might be asking for someone's social security number, but there might be another way to do the same thing, but it might require you to like come in person and show your driver's license. I'm giving this for instance. This might not be a real for instance. If that's the case, we need to let people know that like, hey, you have the ability to do it this way, but you might also be able to do it that way. And sometimes because we are the state, so at the state and the federal level, there are things that people have to do that they don't have the option necessarily to not participate. Even if that's the case, we need to tell them so that they can make an informed decision about it and they can understand it. One of the things that we run into is that sometimes people don't realize that they have the ability to choose, and that feeling doesn't engender trust. And part of what we do as the state, right, one of the main ways that we are able to provide the resources that our folks need and to help is based on the data that we get. So if they don't trust us, they won't want to give us the correct data, and the whole system breaks down, or at least it doesn't run as efficiently as it should. Then purpose specification. So this is a really good one. Purpose specification is something really simple, right? We're articulating the authority for which we are collecting the information. So that might be, hey, we are Health and Human Services, and so this is part of what we do. In order to give you these things that are related to that, we collect this information, and this is how we process it. Now, with that, what that means is that we don't want to be using the data for a purpose other than what we've said. So if we said we were collecting the data, say, to help you with health related stuff, we don't want to then send the data off for some other purpose that we haven't explained to the folks that we could or might use it for. So it doesn't mean that we can't, and it doesn't mean that we wouldn't. What it means is that we need to be telling people up front what we're going to do with their data and then actually adhering to that. So we're keeping ourselves accountable, and we're setting up a system that can make them have more trust in the government, as they should, because so many of the services that they need, they can only get through us. So then data minimization. So one of the things that I always hear with data minimization is this common misconception that we're saying, oh, you can't collect data that you need, right? That's not what this means at all. What it says is that the organization should only collect PII that is directly relevant and necessary to accomplish that specific purpose. right? And that you only retain it for as long as you need to. And this is an easy one because it doesn't mean that we don't collect the data that we need. We're not saying don't collect data that you need. We're saying be thoughtful about what you need. If you only need 5 different data elements, don't collect all 10 just because that would be cool and maybe you'll use it later, right? That invalidates that whole purpose specification and stuff. If you don't know now what you're going to do with it, then wait till you do know and then ask for the data. So, and data minimization also means this. It means good data hygiene, right? We don't want to have multiple copies of things sitting out there. Data minimization is about cleaning up our house, right? Cleaning up the systems that we have that have, like we may have 4 different sets of addresses on folks that we don't need, and some of these are out of date. It's making sure that we're using the data in a way that is respectful and that also helps us. So data minimization helps them, it helps us, and it's all around a good process. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, use limitation. So the organization should use PII solely for the purpose specified in the notice. And I really think that this makes sense. And I think sometimes that when we work in big entities like the state, or if we were in the federal government or some other large entity, we could forget and think, well, I can use it for this. It would be so helpful for this. These might even be services that the people in our state could really use. But the thing of it is that if we haven't told them, then sharing it like that isn't appropriate because they don't know. It can come as a nasty surprise. We don't know what everybody wants to do with their data. And so we need to not be doing things that we haven't told folks about. We shouldn't be surprising them. This breaks down the trust that they have in us and that they should have in us, because this is how we are able to provide the best services to them. Then data quality and integrity. So the organization, to the extent practical, should ensure that the PII is accurate, it's relevant, it's timely, it's complete, right? Part of what will help that is if we aren't keeping all this other data under the data minimization principle, right? We don't have all this data that we just don't need. It's old, it's not good, and then we're confused as to where we need to look to for the most current information. I won't beat that one down. I think that one's pretty clear, and we all know that if you don't have good data, then the decisions that you're making aren't necessarily excuse me, just one second. The decisions that you're making aren't necessarily going to be accurate. Then security, everybody I know has taken some security training by now or is at least aware of it. Hopefully you've all taken it through the state, but if not, you've probably had to take it for some other aspect of it. We all know that it's important. These are things that we should be keeping an eye on. We should be protecting the data against the loss of risk, unauthorized access, destruction, modification, and inappropriate disclosure, right? All of those things are bad and bad for different reasons. So this makes sense, and we all know we need to do it. Now, accountability and auditing. I feel like this particular principle gets a bad rap. People say, oh, no, not an audit, right? But part of having accountability and auditing, and part of the reason that we all want people to be accountable is that if we didn't have this in place, even with the best of intentions, if there's not something that holds us accountable, we tend to backslide on those things. So it's good for us to have this. It's a straightforward way for us to make sure that we can keep the trust of the people who give us their data, and that helps us with good decision making. It also helps us to find out when there are problems, right? So if we have, inadvertently mishandled data, then being able to pull this up and understand it is very helpful. Okay, I see a question. I will leave that to Kelly because I can't read it right now. Okay, so the FIPS apply whenever we're using PII, and overall we should be thinking about this, and we should be thinking about it as part of our daily lives. So in conjunction with the FIPS, which are part of or one of our policies and is the primary privacy policy, we also have the data protection and handling policy that we also need to apply with it. And this is what tells us how we need to protect the data. Okay, so next slide, please. So as part of this discussion, I thought that one of the great things that we could do, and to clear up the what's the difference between privacy and cybersecurity, that we would have someone in from ESRMO, Enterprise Security Risk, the Enterprise Security Risk Management Office, to talk with us about this. And we have invited Eric Zach, who is our Deputy Chief Risk Officer. Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us. Love the background. So the slide that's up now is showing the areas for privacy. And if we look on the left in that gray area, these are those fair information practice principles that I was talking about, right? So this is the management of your privacy, where you're only using it for things that you're supposed to be using it for, that you're handling it appropriately, the notice that we're given to folks, giving them the choice and the consent, telling them how we're going to use it, retain it, quality, and the like. But this section here in the middle, we have that are overlapping. So we can see what cybersecurity is doing, and then we can see where we have some overlapping areas. So Eric, I thought it would be helpful if maybe we could talk, and maybe if you could share some of the ways that privacy and ESRMO and or cybersecurity work together. So what are some of the things that we do together?
Yeah, happy to join the conversation, and thanks for having me. Real quick, I want to answer Tim Atkinson's question. So he asked, is someone's home phone or personal cell phone considered PII in today's world, where companies, thinking more specifically telemarketers, are accessing those numbers oftentimes without an individual's knowledge?
Yes, most definitely.
So simple question, but a great question. And I'll share a quick story that happened a couple of months ago. We have a partner that's a vendor that works with the state. Obviously, I'm not going to share their name for their own privacy, but they called my work phone, which again is a number that's distributed pretty widely. And it was a Raleigh number, but I didn't recognize it. I didn't have their number saved, so I just Googled the cell phone number, and in just a couple of seconds was able to pull who this user was, what their cell phone number was, and their home address, including a walkthrough of, their previous Zillow listings, or what's the other one, Redfin listings. So in a matter of just a couple of seconds, I had a home address, username, cell phone number, and a bunch of other additional information about this individual that was calling me about a work issue, right? So I think that ties into your question really closely, Tim, and some of the concerns that our office specifically deals with, and a lot of times is a frequent conversation during incident response activities, right? Is how are we using data, and if there is a compromise, what does that data then lead to from a security and a risk concern? So obviously this is a really great visual aid to show where there's overlap between the privacy office and the security office. But what we see a lot of times nowadays, especially when responding to things like ransomware events, those threat actors are stealing data, right? One of the key initiatives that they're doing is stealing the entity or organization's data, and they're trying to use that to extort that entity. So how does that impact you, right? Well, if you all are like me, I have several hundred different passwords that I don't keep track of. I can't remember all of that, right? So what typically we see happen is people reuse passwords so that they have one that they remember, and hopefully it's a good long password that has good security measures in place. But if it's reused and it's stolen, these threat actors are now starting to target individuals on personal accounts, things like your LinkedIn, your Facebook, right? And they're gaining access to those accounts as well, and then leveraging that against you. So this conversation around privacy and data and how it's used and how it's protected is continuing to become a bigger emphasis across, not only our country and our nation and our state, but really globally. Cherie was sharing with us, there was a document that was released, this past week, Cherie, from the UK, that was some of their privacy controls and laws that they're releasing. And I think you said it was close to 1,000 pages in length. So our office's have to partner and have to work together with our initiatives across the state and within DIT for the services that we're providing, because unfortunately the privacy of your data and how we're using the data is the foundation of cybersecurity, right? That's really our sole purpose as a job, is to make sure that the data we're collecting, one, we have approval to collect it and we're collecting it in a secured manner, but two, that we understand what the implications are if there is a compromise. Um, I think everybody's probably heard the saying, it's not a matter of if anymore, but a matter of when. And that shows true with tons of these, huge organizations and private sector and government that have continued to be targeted by threat actors, either, foreign countries or other significant entities that are trying to gain access, or those that are, monetarily driven, that want to steal your data and try and force you to pay for it. So we absolutely have to work together. We have a great relationship, Cherie and I, and our two offices. We're hoping Cherie gets some support because she's a one-man shop right now. But it's absolutely a must that we have to work together, and it's exactly scenarios like that I described earlier, right? That was more than likely the user that had contacted me. They had entered their information in a service that they requested and asked for. But it's important that you read privacy laws and privacy notices on those companies, because a lot of times they have right in there, hey, we're going to take your data and we're going to sell it to third parties all over the place. And sometimes you can opt out of that, other times you can't. And I think, myself included, a lot of times we don't want to go through and read that fine print, but it is really important that we do, because at the end of the day, it's your data and you want to be able to control it. I'll give a side plug that our partners at the National Guard gave me. There's an application that you can download that helps you manage that with different third parties and vendors across the space. It's called Permission Slip. So that's one that I've used personally. You can go in and you can put your email address and some of your contact information, and you give them the authority to reach out to these third parties and say, hey, I don't want you to send my information out. So would encourage you all to look at that. The accounts that you do have, whether it's, grocery stores or home improvement, banking accounts, even, all of those different things are very, very important and very important to protect. So that ties into the security piece. We want to make sure we're using passwords. They're independent of other accounts. They have good security measures in length and complexity. You're using biometrics and multi-factor authentication where possible. All those things come into play, and at the end of the day, it's directly for the privacy of your data.
Wow, thank you. What a great way to tie all that together. So somebody asked, can we provide that link? I think that would be great. Yeah, I'm definitely going to get on that as well. So one of the other ways, or I should say some of the other ways that we also work together that some folks on this call will be impacted by is in the completion of our privacy threshold analyses, right? So we have worked together, our two offices have worked together to create a combined document that asks the questions that we both need to know, and to help to reduce the lift on getting these sorts of things done from a compliance standpoint. We also coordinate on awareness and training, and we coordinate with incident response. So things that involve PII, we also coordinate on that. And then what will be coming in this coming year that maybe folks have not heard about yet is that we are also going to be working on doing a data inventory. So we need to be inventorying the data that we have across the state so that we know what we have and can ensure that we're protecting it in the best way possible. So we're working together on all of those things. We also work together on guidance and updating guidance that applies to both privacy and security. Yeah, I think it's almost impossible to get this job done without looking at both sides of this. I heard someone explain it that privacy was like the castle, right? So like we're concerned with keeping the data in, and also who's using the data within the castle, right? and that cybersecurity is like working, like, so they're on the perimeter making sure that the threats from outside are stopped. But a lot of it is overlapping, and that's what's being shown here on the graph. And it's important to understand that these are complementary but distinct areas, and that we do have to work together if we're going to help to protect data and to keep our privacy intact. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide and talk about tips for protecting our privacy. So we've looked at privacy in the workplace and we thought about that. But let's think about some of the things if we were protecting our privacy at home, and this can apply also in the workplace, right? Protecting our privacy is about making informed decisions about what to share and how we use the data that we're entrusted with. So not only do we want to be giving the people who are going to be sharing their data with the state, a good overview of what it is we're doing and getting their permission and only using it as we should. We need to think about this as we go about in our own lives, what data we are giving to others, and what that may lead to. So I have friends, and I won't say that it's necessarily a generational thing, but I think there's a certain group that are very interested in sharing their birthdays and a lot of personal information online in what seems to be a friendly format. And what I always think about the internet that people tend to forget is that it's not full of friends. Even if you think that those people are your friends, you never know who you're really talking with, right? So the AG's office usually has people out there trying to track down these people posing as stuff. We think about people who are scammed and the love scams and everything else, right? Where people convince them to give away their personal information so they can then drain their bank accounts, or they pretend to be somebody else and get information out of you. There's also for years there was revenge porn, right? And now all the states have revenge porn laws, and a lot of that stem from people, pretending to be one thing and getting information or getting videos and things out from others, and then using it to get money and stuff out of them, to extort things from them. This is still happening, and it's happening with teenagers, and it is very unfortunate. So when we talk about privacy, we need to be thinking about that. People who have the opinion that they have nothing to hide don't understand the value of the data that they have and how it can be used against them. And then the other thing that I think we also need to think about when we think about our children is that they are developing, right? So they don't necessarily have the same level of reasoning. They may not make the same decisions that we would, and we have to make sure that we keep track of what's going on with them and what's going on with their data to make sure they don't get overexposed and subject to those sorts of risks. So what's the other things? Okay, so I know that none of us have all read all the privacy policies. I admit it, even me, right? They're too long, they're boring, what have you. And we're looking at making those changes. But this week is a good time to go back in and check those things, to go back in and look at what your privacy settings are, what your privacy and security settings are for all of the different apps and the different platforms that you're on. Sometimes they will make changes. You know how those policies can always be updated, the privacy policies, the terms of use, and you may not be aware of it. So it's a good thing to just set aside some period in time, some recurring regular period in time where you go back and check those things and make sure things haven't changed in a way that you won't be happy with or that will impact your privacy. The other thing is to understand what the app is asking permission for. So several years ago, they had a study that came out, and it was so alarming. A lot of the apps had been asking for, and I think this has gotten a little better, but not as good as we would hope. And so it's always important to remember this, that some of the apps ask for access to things that you wouldn't necessarily be aware of. And this is why you need to look at that, right? So you may have an app that would have no need to be listening to you, and yet it asks to have access to your microphone, right? Or to have access to your camera. And you don't know when that would be on or when it would be running. Maybe your app is running in the background, and that can be a problem. So it could be eavesdropping on you and getting information. And you really need to be careful and be mindful of what it's saying and why it's saying, and asking yourself whether or not that's something you agree with. There are also there's an ability on your phones, likely, depending on the type of phone you have, to prevent some of that. This is getting better every year, but we still know of lots of cases where there have been problems. So it's always important to look at it and make sure, and to never just assume that the company has your best interest at heart and that everything will be fine, right? It's trust but verify, right? Even if you want to trust, you still need to verify. It's also important to understand what social media your family is using and the risks to the privacy and safety for that. Sometimes we're giving away more data than we're aware of, even if it's not necessarily us, right? So we may have family members who are telling people about how we're going off on vacation. They have already shared where we live, that we're going on vacation, and when we'll be gone. Well, this is the perfect invitation for lurkers to come, stop by your house and see what they can get. So these are important things to think about that we don't normally think about, or that a lot of these platforms that we're on, they're keeping a record of all the information that we've ever given. So maybe we didn't give this information, that Fluffy is the name of our dog and Jones is our maiden name, but that's information that is there to be had. And then you add this other piece of the puzzle, and then someone can take your identity. So we need to think about what the cumulative data is that's out there on us, and to be mindful of not sharing it, and to teach our family members about the risks as well. We also want to always be looking at the default settings. So for a lot of things, we've had entities like the FTC get involved and say, hey, this isn't right, that like the default settings on this type of social media are to be public. Sometimes we have our kids are on social media, and we don't realize that the default setting is that now it's advertised to everyone on the internet, right? That our kids are on there, and then they become vulnerable. So it's important to look at the default settings, to not overshare. I'll share this one quick story, since I know I have to be mindful of time, but it sticks in my mind to this day. My husband so this is not a story of like an urban legend where somebody knew somebody and we didn't know him. This is a story where this was one of my husband's friends. His daughter was dating a guy, and they took pictures together, right? And in this picture, she was at a party and had a one of those red cups of beer, and she was drinking underage. And he tagged her in this picture, and then was able to track what she was doing with social media and all of that, even though they had broken up. When she went to apply for a job, he was able to tag that and send it to the company, and they withdrew the job offer to her because of that, based on moral fitness. So I think that, it's very important for us to think about that. And I think that one of the things that we learn as we get older is to be more private, is to understand better how to protect our privacy and the risks at stake with that. And I particularly worry about that for our children, and also for older folks who may not be as savvy with the types of schemes that we're seeing. The other thing I think that's important to note is that we used to always say, like, oh, you can tell if it's it's a good check on whether or not this is a fake email or a fake request based on the bad language and all of that. Remember that with AI, that won't be the case anymore. AI can draft something that will seem like it's written by someone that and it will seem much more trustworthy. And so we always have to be mindful of that and asking ourselves these questions, right? We want to be suspicious of any unsolicited emails or text messages. We want to consider the validity of any requests that we're getting. We also want to verify and go to the source. So one of the things is like, periodically I get these things where, Amazon's going to close my account, blah, 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 right? Or whoever it is. You want to go to the source to check that out. So I'll just be honest with you. I've reached a point where I just assume most of that is not true and don't even bother with go to the source. But if I did think that it might be true, I would go to the source. I would never ever click on something, and I would never ever give someone my information over the phone. So one of the things that happened when I was living in Maryland before I moved here that I just thought was just crushing is that somebody who was new to this country got that fake phone call from the IRS, right, that they're going to arrest you and all this stuff, and wound up giving all of their personal information over the phone to someone that they thought to prevent them from going to jail, not realizing that that's not how that works in the US. So I think we always have to be mindful of how people can be scammed. And I see, yeah, somebody was talking about people being scammed. I have to think, I always think, and probably those of you have heard me talk about this before, I've heard this story, but we had someone that we also knew in our old neighborhood who was a little bit older and got a phone call about a problem with their computer, right? And since most people are on a Windows machine, it was about Windows, and the man said, oh, no, I'm on Apple. And they managed to convince him to go in through his Mac and still took his information. So it's really important to think about it, to always be mindful that there are people out there trying to get our information, that our data is worth money. We should never be giving it away. And the more that we give it away, the more that it's out there and the more people can piece together information about us to do these sorts of scams. So the other things that I think are worth considering and bringing up here are that we don't have to search like the search engines. There are other search engines, right? If we wanted to be more safe, we can go to like DuckDuckGo. There's Privacy Badger. We can disable our cookies. We can do things that even if they are maybe a little more labor intensive for us, can really be keeping us from being tracked all across the platforms. So I always get that, like, how are people tracking me all across the platforms? And a lot of this is down to what you choose to do, the platforms that you're on, the cookies that you accept, and the tracking that you allow. Okay, so now we've looked at in the workplace, and now we've looked at the consumer stuff. But next slide, please. Let's look at one more area, which is, so on our website, so the Office of Privacy and Data Protection has put up a section on consumer resources. Now, the reason that I did this is because we regularly get to our inbox all these questions from consumers who are concerned. So as many of you may know, the Department of Justice is responsible for handling that, right? So they handle consumer financial protection, but then we also have several other entities that would also field complaints. And so on this site, we've put together information about what the North Carolina Department of Justice does in terms of protecting folks and how to contact them, what the Federal Trade Commission, what the Federal Communications Commissions, what those two agencies do, and how they can protect you depending on what your complaint was. We have links to the student privacy policy from the Department of Education, the Consumer Federation of America. We have advice on how to avoid scams, consumer alerts. We're also going to be updating this site more often as we go through and get some more staff. So this is a good site to go to. It's also good to help people to see in case there are things that you want to be familiar with. And if you were talking with someone in your family who may not know or have these sorts of complaints, this is a good place that you can go to talk about it and to get that information and move forward with it. Then we also have on our site, we have agency resources. Okay, yeah, perfect. So we have agency resources, and in the agency resources, we have things like the state and federal privacy laws that govern the use of personally identifiable information in the state. So I hope that it is that everybody here does know this, but when we get federal data, which we do get, that the privacy protections that were on that stick with it, even when it's in the state's hands. So this is the reason that we need to be aware of what the federal laws are in addition to the state laws. We also have our state policies here and our memoranda. So the privacy and security documentation is here, just to try to give you a one-stop shop, to try to give you the best chance of finding the stuff that you need when you do have questions about privacy. Okay, and next slide. Okay, so privacy services for state agencies. So the office offers a lot of different services, and I know that several of you on the call are aware of this, but some may not be. We can help with privacy guidance and consultation. So you have like an issue that you're concerned about and you want to ask about in terms of privacy with the state, we can go ahead and talk with you and help you with that. We also do procurement related reviews. So if there's something that has a privacy component to it, we look at that. We help with language. We help with identifying the risks, maybe even who else we need to talk to. We might need to bring in ESRMO. It might be an aspect that overlaps both of our areas. Privacy incident response. So when things involve PII, privacy also gets involved. We also do breach support. We do privacy and data breach exercises. So if you wanted to go through and figure out where you had vulnerabilities in your existing policies for the agency and how you handle it, we can do that as well. We do data privacy and data protection maturity assistance. We do program maturity assistance. All of that is looking at where, from a strategic standpoint, where should we be going? Where do we want to go? How can we best protect privacy within the state? And then, oh yes, and privacy federal alignment support. So just like I was telling you how that the federal data that comes to us, the requirements remain on there. Sometimes we fall into a situation where we find out that maybe we haven't handled it in the same way that we think that we should have. And this looks at how do we go back and fix that? Like, what can we do to rehab to get more in alignment with the federal requirements? So that is just in a nutshell some of the things that the office does. We also help with privacy impact assessments, with privacy threshold analysis, with creating them, and then also providing guidance on questions that you may have about it and like that. Both privacy and ESRMO are going to be working on an AI privacy impact assessment since we are moving in that direction. That is something that we also do. We also keep abreast of privacy laws, and we update about all of those sorts of things. So I think that about covers the things that I had to talk about today. And if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to the office, and you can reach out through ditprivacy@nc.gov.
And Cherie, we have a few more minutes. If anybody has any questions, put your hands up or put it in the chat, and we can talk through some of those.
Yeah, so I'm seeing one now which says, as AI is increasingly integrated into organizations, how can organizations and the state ensure? Oh, so I love this question. How can we ensure that AI doesn't compromise the privacy rights? So on our webpage also, we have an AI privacy corner, and we have put up some guidance about for generative AI, and the state is currently working on a framework for AI that will provide overall guiding principles and things like that. But so I think one of the things that we need to always remember is that the fair information practice principles apply no matter what technology we're using. So all those things that we talked about earlier apply even in an AI environment.
Yeah. Hey, Cherie, speaking of AI, can you share a little bit about is there any guidance you can give folks on using like ChatGPT and other kind of publicly generative AI tools?
Yeah. So I'm glad you bring up this question. And I know many of you have heard the secretary speak about this as well. Using open AI, like open generative AI, is particularly risky, and we don't want to put any PII into that, because that data that goes in is then it's out in the world. It's used as essentially training data. So whenever I talk about this with like the privacy points of contact and others, I always say, hey, don't be Samsung, because Samsung went before us and this same thing happened to them, where someone from their company put in proprietary information, right? And then it was out there and they can't get it back. So we never want to put in any kind of PII, any kind of sensitive information, anything that wouldn't be public information. We don't want to put into an open AI, because that will be problematic. We can't get it back. So what can seem very innocuous, and you sometimes have that feeling like, oh, we're protected, not necessarily. So we don't want to do that, and we always want to be mindful of that. That's right. So Laura brings up this. She's exactly right, that she's heard that you shouldn't charge a phone at a place such as an airport or on a charging pad, because it's easy for someone to steal the data. So that definitely is true about the plugins at the airport. That is regularly, they are found to have that. That also applies to hotels, and they've even found it on planes, right? So you know how we have those plugins in the plane? They've also found that in the plane. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's amazing to me, because I would just think like, wow, you think that somebody was in here and doing that. So yeah, so it's always best to err on the side of doing it yourself. Yeah, always, if you do have to charge, charge directly from the wall with your own plug-in. Never just plug into it.
So it looks like we have a question from Sarah. Do you recommend using a password manager to manage using different passwords for each account? Is it risky to have one master password? I don't know if Eric or if you want to comment on that.
Yeah,
I can take that one, Cherie, if you want.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so you'll see in a lot of the recommendations and trainings that come from the security office that it is recommended to use password managers like that. To be honest, I think there's pros and cons, right? Overall, it probably is a more secure solution, because you're able to then use those managers to generate secure passwords oftentimes that are entirely random, right? It's not using your dog's name and the year your daughter was born and things that you can easily remember, that are oftentimes pulled from sources like social media, and they have now generative AI and AI tools that are parsing that kind of data and trying to do what's called brute force attacks, where they just piece those different data sets together and try to get access to your information. So, the one challenge really that I see is it's a centralized location for all of your passwords. So you've probably seen over the past several years, there have been instances of breaches of even password management companies. I think LastPass was a big one that was recently publicized, that they were compromised and millions of people's records were stolen. So there's always risk, right? But as you use tools like that, I think holistically it does help you, one, manage your accounts, but two, is often a more secure solution than the alternative of, hey, I've got to try to remember all this stuff, and I've got to try and use random passwords or phrases that I probably am not going to remember. So there's pros and cons. I know that doesn't explicitly answer the question, but yeah, I think those tools are becoming more and more popular, because they do allow you to be more secure in a holistic manner.
Yeah, I would agree. And I do think that even though we're seeing breaches there, that in itself is easier than if you see, like, I don't know how many people on here have Apple phones, where it lets you know whether some password of yours has been reused, or if it's been subject to a breach. But those sorts of things can be really helpful. And I do think in this day and age, it's nearly impossible for us to keep up with all the passwords ourselves. And even sometimes with the hints that we give, I know myself, I've had that situation where I've not been able to recall, even with a hint, what my password could possibly be. So, and I think along with that, two-factor authentication as well, whenever we're going to do that, is helpful to cut down on the risk.
One of the other things that just
Yeah.
quickly I'll mention, some of the phishing emails and those types of activities that Cherie mentioned earlier, those have malware that's now exporting those password lists from your browsers. So if you are storing passwords in like a Chrome browser or an Edge browser, definitely that's not within that category of a secure password manager, right? It does hold that information, but it's very, very easily stolen information if you do get compromised. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about ways that you can store those passwords, create secure passwords. I know the browsers all do that in a manner, but it's not a very secure one.
So,
Yeah.
someone has a question. Timothy writes, DIT does not have any recommended password managers that a full review and support for use has been conducted.
Yeah, that's correct. So it's on our to-do list, one of many things. We're looking at potential enterprise options that would work as a password manager. I can tell you just from a personal use perspective, I use Keeper as the application. It is a paid service. I think it's like $40 a year, but that's one that I've used, that I've looked at a little bit, that I think is relatively good in that space. Again, that's not an ESRMO sanction, just for the
Okay.
But yeah, we are looking at something enterprise wide, identifying one or potentially a handful of solutions that we can say as a state would be acceptable. I'll caveat that too. If you do have questions, I've passed to several state agencies. They're doing their own research, so they're helping us in that space of looking into possible solutions. So certainly reach out to your internal security office if you're interested and want to begin some of that conversations, and they may be able to help as well.
All right, we have just a couple more minutes. There's a question that earlier someone wrote. Can you speak to OSHR sending bulletins to emails that have links for external sites that are on YouTube, or events that require registration on external likes? What is the recommendation for registration of services and creating like, I guess, like, should we use our state email address? Should we use a personal email address, or is there any thoughts you have on that as far as how we manage state data and such?
Sure. So I would say that anything that you're doing in the state capacity or that's coming to your state email address should be responded to from that, right? So one of the things that we don't want is to be sprinkling the information here and there and making that connection between your home life and your work life. So in general, my guidance has always been to do that. So even when we're looking at things that we're signing up for, if it's coming to us from the state, then we want to be using our state IDs so that we have better control over where the information is flowing from and flowing to, and that we're not mixing those two up. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well,
I'm sorry. One last thing is that if we are sending any third-party links, it's helpful and a good practice to go ahead and make note of that in there, and to let people look at the privacy policies and any of the settings there as well. So it's always good to check all of that and make sure that you're comfortable with sharing it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well, we're at 1 o'clock, so I think if anybody has any questions, I'll put the email address, and you can reach out to Cherie and her team after this. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks so much, everybody. Have a good day and happy Data Privacy Week.